So Stewart's Chapel, this is the last of the devotions, unless something happens that causes me and Don to say, okay, we need to do more. This is the last of the devotions. And this is the last of the series, In the Presence of Predators. This is Monday, March the 7th. You know what? I should have probably dealt with this sooner or more often, probably. I think that at some point earlier on I hinted at it. But I want to end this with this idea. Don't let predation define you. Don't let what the predator has taken from you define you. Don't let the scars and the bites of the predator define you. God desires for you and I to be defined by His hand, not the hand of the devil. A lot of times I'll hear people share their testimony and it's almost like they're still stuck there. God's people will do bad things, and we looked at that yesterday, to one another. The world will do bad things to us. The enemy will do bad things to us. But you and I should not be defined by what the predator has done to us. I want to read in Psalms 91, verses 1 through 2, and then verses 14 through 16. But then I want to walk you through the life of John Mark. Mark, the writer of the Gospel of Mark, and his story. And I want to tell you a story about John Mark that when I was studying caught my attention. If there was a man that could have been defined by what the enemy did, this would be one. Joseph in the Bible. Joseph even said, what you meant for evil, God has meant for good. Joseph chose to not let what evil was done to him define him. That is rare. For most of us, that is not the case. Let's read Psalms 91, verses 1 and 2. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my fortress, my refuge. My God, in Him I will trust. Surely He shall deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence. And then verses 14 through 16. Because He has set His love upon me, therefore I will deliver him. I will set him on high, because he has known my name. He shall call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in the trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. Did you notice up in verse 3, it wasn't one of the verses, I read it anyway. It talks about he shall deliver him from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence. In other words, it lets us know that this individual has been trapped by a predator. He's been caught. God comes and God delivers him. And what's going to define him is what God does and not what the enemy does. That's always a choice with us. What's going to define us, whether it's God or the enemy. John Mark, do you know what John Mark was called? John Mark has two names throughout church history, which I thought was interesting. Stump finger. Stump finger. Evidently, John Mark had either an accident when very young or some kind of birth defect that people called him stump-fingered. He was identified, marked because of some kind of handicap with his hand. He was called stump-finger. But when you come into the New Testament, his name also means Yahweh is gracious. In other words, God has showed up. So he had some kind of physical thing wrong with him that could have marked him, some kind of disability that could have marked him. But what the New Testament chooses to reveal is that God has been gracious to him. Now, John Mark's testimony is a journey from back and forth, back and forth. I want to take you through it just a real quick, just through the journey of Mark. He's from the house of Mary. He's a boy with a significant loss, a stump finger. He's a boy of means. He's found to be where people are praying early on. He's a boy with abundance. He's a boy of recognition. He's a boy of legacy because of his family. In Acts chapter 13, verse 5, he becomes a chosen boy, a chosen man by Paul and Barnabas. He becomes their assistant or scribe or record of events, which means that he was a man of education. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, we find out that his cousin was Barnabas. He's a cousin of Barnabas, which means he has an honorable family. We also find in Colossians 4:10 that he was a Levite, so he's a boy with a very good history, a chosen history. In Mark chapter 14, verse 13, he's the boy that is carrying the water. He has a servant heart. In Mark chapter 14, verses 51 through 52, he's a boy, he's a man with an embarrassing story because he's the one that runs away in the garden because somebody took his robe and he runs away naked. He had a defining moment when it could have been his name could have been different. And that is in Acts chapter 13, verse 13, when he chooses to leave Paul and Barnabas and to go home. At that moment, he is described as a deserter. That could have been who Mark was, but that's not the rest of the story of Mark. In chapter 15, verse 36 through 38, Paul marks him. Paul marks John Mark, marks him as good for nothing, not good to have as a side companion, no, not untrustworthy, and on and on and on. But decades later, Mark overcomes the mark that Paul put on him. In Colossians 4:10, we find him as a man who will suffer for Christ and not look back. We find him a man that is welcomed by Paul and other followers of Christ. In Philemon, verse 22, in Philemon, he's a man known as a laborer of Christ. In 2 Timothy 4:11, he's a man who is useful to Paul and to other believers. In 1 Peter 5:13, he's a man who Peter holds dear and all the apostles hold dear. History goes on to tell us the rest of the story of John Mark. He becomes the interpreter for Peter before all of the Roman officials. He becomes the writer of the Gospel of Mark. He goes on to Alexandria, Egypt, where he begins to start churches, where he had learned how to do that with Paul and Barnabas. And April 25th, 68 AD, he will be killed because he boldly preached that there was only one Lord Jesus. As a result, the people of Alexandria put a rope around his neck, dragged him through the streets until he was dead. The enemy will come into our life. Predators will come. Sometimes we will be those predators. There's no way living in the world that we're going to escape the marks of the wolves, of the lion, of the vipers. The predators will come. But you and I have a choice. Not to avoid predation, but how is that predation going to define us? Mark could have always been known as stump-fingered, but he became known as Yahweh, or God is gracious. He didn't always do the right thing. There were times when he gave in to the lusts of the world, but he ends well. And I got a feeling those at the end didn't see much of the marks of the predator. You know which marks ought to be seen on us? Are the marks of the crucified Christ. As we die to ourselves and pick up our own cross and follow him. Predators will come. false prophets and teachers and wolves will come into our life. But do not allow them to define you. What the enemy means for evil, God desires for good in you and I life. Make a decision today, because some of you that are listening, you may be allowing some of your past to define you. I don't know how much time I got, Don. This is the last devotion. Where are we? What is it?
It's 10 minutes. You can go long as you want.
All right. So I'm going to, let me tell you this. There is a man that I know. He has a good heart. But every now and then an ugly part comes out of him. This man had a parent. This parent was not godly. This parent abused him. Now that period of predation was just a few years. This man is 40-some years past that event. But the anger, the unforgiveness, and sometimes even rage at the mention of this one person. He will tell you that he has no desire, never wanted a desire to be anything like this other person. And yet, as I have told him to his face, that person defines him way, way too much. The presence of Christ's hands in our life and the presence of what the work of Christ should be that which defines us, not the work of Satan. Isn't it interesting, though? It doesn't take much of the work of Satan. It can be just one thing in our life. And we'll hold on to it. We'll almost allow it to tattoo us or to brand us. And it will shape us. It takes a godly man or woman to allow the hands of Christ to define them more than the hands of the enemy. John Mark could have been defined by what the world and by his own mistakes. But John Mark did not let predation define him. Don't you let what the enemy has done or seeks to do in you define you. Love you.